Leslie Prer was a 49-year-old woman happily living in Chevy Chase, Washington, D.C. On May 2nd, 2001, Leslie said goodbye to her husband, who left for work early that morning. Leslie, meanwhile, got ready for her job at a popular advertising firm in town called Specialties Incorporated. Leslie was known to be punctual and never missed her shifts. However, she failed to show up for work that day. This was completely out of character for her. If she needed time off, she always notified her boss. If she was ill, she would always call. Her boss decided to contact Leslie's husband, Carl, who said he had no idea where Leslie was. Concerned, Carl and Leslie's boss then decided to check on Leslie at her home. Upon arriving at the house, they knocked at the door with no response. Calling out Leslie's name, they were met with silence. Upon entering, they were met with a horrifying sight. There was blood spattered and smeared on the walls in the foyer. In the corner by the door, dried blood marred the floor next to a puddle of water. An overturned table lay nearby, and a rug, also stained with dried blood, had been moved from the foyer into the living room. Calling out his wife's name, Carl was met with an eerie silence. The two men immediately called the police. Police quickly arrived on scene, only to make a gruesome discovery upstairs. Police found Leslie Prer dead in her bedroom. A detective later told a reporter it was, quote, a pretty brutal crime scene. An autopsy revealed that Leslie had been brutally beaten, suffering multiple blunt force traumas and deep bruising to her neck, which suggested strangulation. Her injuries were consistent with her head being battered into the foyer floor. This led investigators to believe that her head had been smashed into the sharp edges of the baseboard molding of the home. Police found blood under Leslie's fingernails and bruising on her arms, suggesting she had fought her attacker fiercely. Her body was found in the shower of her primary bedroom, where investigators believe her killer had carried her from the foyer so he could wash away the blood and prevent further bleeding in the home. The killer tried to clean up the crime scene. A luminescence test revealed additional evidence of blood in the foyer and in a trash can, as well as in sinks in the kitchen and in the downstairs bathroom, and on door frames and the back of the bedroom door. The horrific crime left the close-knit community in a state of shock and disbelief. In the days after the murder, police took as much evidence as they could, which included processing the scene for fingerprints, swabbing suspected blood samples, taking photographs, and vacuuming the foyer area for hairs and other artifacts. But due to the limited DNA technology at the time, no suspects were ever identified. Neighbors said they had not seen anything unusual on the day Leslie was killed, and her husband Carl was ruled out using samples of his own blood. With no leads nor suspects, the case eventually went cold. In 2022, police submitted the DNA collected from the bloody crime scene to Othram. Utilizing funds collected from both private and public donations, both of which are key in solving cold crimes, Othram was able to develop a DNA profile for the killer. The DNA profile soon yielded a common surname for the suspect, Kilgore. On June 4th, 2024, police uncovered an old tip submitted back in 2002 about someone named Eugene Kilgore. The tipster, a previous neighbor of Kilgore's, said that he, quote, thought that he may be somehow related to the Leslie Prer murder. He was 21 when the killing occurred. At that time, he was neither interviewed nor swabbed for DNA. With this new information in hand, detectives waited at Dulles International Airport as Eugene Kilgore opened a water bottle, drank from it, and threw it away. Only after Kilgore had moved on did detectives grab the bottle. His DNA was extracted from the water bottle and tested with DNA found at the crime scene. It was a clear match. Eugene Kilgore was charged with first-degree murder and was arrested in Washington, D.C. on June 18, 2024. Kilgore had an extensive criminal history, including weapons possession and driving under the influence, as well as theft. It was found that Kilgore had actually dated Leslie's daughter, Lauren, for 5 years. They had begun dating when they were in high school. Kilgore grew up in the same neighborhood as the Prers, and their families were acquainted. Leslie's daughter, Lauren, said that in the 5 years they dated, she watched Kilgore struggle with his parents' divorce and knew that certain relatives of his had volatile tempers. But she said she never experienced violence with him personally, nor did she suspect that he was capable of it. Lauren said that her mom always talked fondly of Kilgore, and that it was her dad who insisted over and over again, quote, "Lauren, there is something off about him." Lauren said that they broke up 5 years later after trying for a long-distance relationship for more than 2 years. She said that at the time of her mother's murder, they had been separated for 3 years. Lauren said she ran into Eugene a few times after her mother's murder. She said she never noticed anything out of the ordinary, however. The most recent sighting of him was last year, in 2023, when Lauren ran into him again at a restaurant after a memorial service for a mutual friend. She said that they talked one-on-one, but that her mom did not come up in conversation. Lauren's father, Carl Prer, died of septic shock in 2017, and was therefore never able to see his wife's killer brought to justice. Authorities have not identified a motive for the killing. However, a judge has denied Kilgore's request for bond. In May of 1996, 24-year-old Julianne Williams, also known as Julie, and her romantic partner, Laura Winans, age 26, went on a camping trip along the Appalachian Trail at Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. The two women had met nearly 2 years prior at Woodswoman, a now defunct nonprofit organization in Minnesota focusing on education and adventure travel for women. The two had connected over their mutual love of the outdoors, and the relationship soon flourished. Laura had also brought along her pet golden retriever named Taj on the ladies' camping trip. The pair left home on May 19, 1996. However, they never arrived back home. Nearly 2 weeks later, on May 31, 1996, Thomas Williams, Julie's father, reported his daughter missing after neither of the women's families had heard from them. Park rangers immediately launched a search of the area for the missing couple, and soon they located Julie and Laura's car just north of Skyland Lodge. During the search, Laura's golden retriever, Taj, was found wandering around, seemingly unharmed. The next day, rangers came upon a campsite and discovered Julie and Laura's bodies. Laura was found in her tent, gagged with her hands bound with duct tape. Her legs were tied with a pair of thermal underwear. Although partially undressed, there were no outward signs of sexual assault. Subsequent forensic analysis showed that the duct-taped gag had previously been used to bind Julie's hands. Julie was found 75 feet from their tent in her sleeping bag. She was naked, gagged, and had her hands bound with duct tape. Investigators noted that, unlike Laura, her legs were not tied. While there was no outward evidence of sexual assault, it was suggested that the two may have been tortured, though no specific details were released. Both women died from having their throats slashed with a sharp knife. Determining the time of death was challenging, but the coroner estimated that the deaths occurred between May 26th to May 28th, although some indications suggest that the deaths may have happened the night of May 24th. Photos left behind in the couple's camera offer a glimpse into the final days of Julie and Laura's lives. The women arrived in Shenandoah National Park on May 19th in 1996, setting off into the woods of the White Oak Canyon Trail, only to return a few days later due to rain. They then hitched a ride with the park ranger and renewed their camping permit before venturing out again. They climbed Hawksbill, the highest mountain in Shenandoah, and made their camp that night in a picturesque spot next to a stream near the Appalachian Trail. Surrounded by the peacefulness of nature, it would be shortly after they set up camp that Julie and Laura's lives would come to a vicious and violent end. Given the women's sexual orientation and the brutal and calculated nature of the murders, authorities wondered if they were victims of a hate crime. An incarcerated man named David Durrell Rice became a suspect in the case. He was known for expressing his hatred toward women and the LGBT community specifically. He was later arrested after an attempted abduction of a female bicyclist in Shenandoah National Park. He would eventually serve a 10-year sentence for the abduction attempt. Investigators continued to look into possible connections between him and the double homicide, and in April of 2002, Rice was indicted on capital murder charges in the Shenandoah National Park killings. In the statement of facts, authorities claimed that he targeted Julie and Laura out of a hatred for women and for the homosexual community. However, 2 years later, the charges against Rice were dropped once it was determined that DNA and hair samples from the crime scene did not match to Rice. Additional testing revealed that the hair found was visually similar under a microscope to that of known serial killer Richard M. Evonitz. In June of 2002, Evonitz was about to be arrested for an unrelated crime, but he ended up killing himself as police closed in. Forensic evidence eventually linked Evonitz to the unsolved murders of 3 teenage girls, all killed in the mid-90s. As these crimes also occurred in Virginia around the same time that Julie and Laura were murdered, Evonitz was considered a suspect, but nothing else connected him to the crime directly. For the next 25 years, the case remained cold. But in 2021, a new FBI Richmond investigative team was assigned to review the case. The task force re-examined previous leads and interviews, as well as evidence recovered from the site of the killings. The team sent the evidence collected from the crime scene and had it retested by an accredited private lab. The private lab collected DNA from, quote, several items of evidence, and with the help of Virginia State Police, the DNA profile was sent to the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, also known as CODIS. Finally, in June of 2024, the DNA was positively matched to Walter Leo Jackson Sr., a convicted serial rapist from Cleveland. Jackson, who had painted homes for a living, died in an Ohio prison in March of 2018. He had an extensive criminal history, including convictions for kidnapping and assault. At the time of the killings, Jackson, who officials said was an avid hiker, was believed to have been driving a 1984 chestnut-brown AMC Eagle 30 and later drove a Ford van. At the news conference, the FBI released details about his vehicles, along with photos of Jackson, and asked the public's help for determining whether or not he had additional victims. While the FBI is still gathering information as to whether Jackson may have murdered more innocent victims, after 28 years, the heinous killing of Julie and Laura is now considered a closed case. Terry Delaway was a 24-year-old woman living with her fiancé, Russell Lee Jr., in a mobile home in rural La Crosse County, Wisconsin. Russell and Terry had been living together for the past 5 years. Terry was studying at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse and was also working at a restaurant called Piggy's. On Valentine's Day in 1985, Terry was working late, and her fiancé, Russell, had been waiting for her. She finally arrived home at around 1 a.m. Russell, who worked as a night auditor at the Radisson La Crosse Hotel, was supposed to start his shift at 11 p.m. However, as they only had one automobile, he had to wait for Terry to return so that he could use the car to get to work. Running already 2 hours late, he rushed out of the home, even though Terry wanted him to stay with her for a while. Russell recalled that Terry seemed tired and also irritable, explaining, quote, "She wanted me to spend some time with her, so she was a little depressed." This was the last time that Russell would see his fiancée alive. Terry had been under a lot of pressure recently, working around 20 to 25 hours a week while also studying hard to graduate that spring. The couple also had financial worries, according to Russell himself. After arriving at work, Russell recalls that he grew concerned about Terry's state of mind and began trying to call her around 2 a.m. When she had continued to not answer, Russell left the Radisson Hotel 2 hours later and drove back to their mobile home. Russell arrived home at around 4 a.m. He found the door slightly open and the lights on. Terry and her poodle Susie were nowhere to be found, but mysteriously left behind were Terry's wallet, keys, and other personal items. Russell hoped that maybe Terry was out walking her dog or that she had met up with a friend. Despite his concern, and with their looming financial struggles on his mind, Russell went back to work. When he finally returned to the mobile home around 6:30 a.m. and Terry was still missing, he contacted her family and the police. Investigators searched the trailer home but found no signs of foul play. For the next 4 days, the media ran Terry's story on all of the local news stations, asking anyone with information about Terry's whereabouts to come forward. However, little clues were gleaned from the investigation. Russell mentioned that the only other unusual event that he could recall was a prowler that had attempted to break into their home the previous Sunday while he was present. He'd called 911 and a squad car was sent to check the area that night, but nothing was found. Another clue came from a neighbor of Terry's, who informed police that he had seen her leave in a car with a short man on the day she disappeared. While the neighbor wasn't completely certain of the exact date, he believed it was around the time of her disappearance. The man, estimated to be between 5'2" and 5'4", was said to be driving an older model 4-door car. However, it is unclear if anything came of this tip. On the 18th of February, 4 days after Terry's disappearance, a man driving on Mohawk Valley Road noticed a glow reflecting off of a bridge sign, which caught his attention. He decided to take a closer look and discovered a burning body in the creek bed. He quickly called authorities from a nearby farmhouse. First responders could tell that the deceased body had not been there for long, and although the body had been decapitated, authorities were able to identify it as 24-year-old Terry, based on the clothing that remained unburned. Fingerprint analysis later confirmed that the body was indeed Terry Delaway's. Terry's fiancé, Russell, was the first person police looked at as a suspect. He had been the last person to see her and had unpaid debts of between $20,000 and $30,000, which police theorized may have been a motive for someone to murder Terry. Russell had refused to give police a list of names of the people to whom he owed money, saying they could not possibly be involved because they were close friends. Police believe that the killer may have followed Terry home that night from Piggy's restaurant. After waiting for Russell to leave for work at the Radisson Lacrosse Hotel, they theorized that the assailant may have entered the mobile home, convinced Terry to leave with him, and then kidnapped and murdered her. Authorities speculated that Terry had been held captive for 3 or 4 days before being murdered. Terry's head was never located, and neither was her dog. Police believe that she was probably decapitated and burned in an effort to prevent authorities from identifying her. But the body did not completely burn, and police were able to identify her by matching fingerprints. The autopsy report indicates that Terry was killed elsewhere and dumped at the culvert where she was found. For 40 years, the case would go cold, with over 500 people being interviewed but no arrests made. The community of La Crosse was left with only fear and confusion. Then, in late September of 2024, Vernon County Sheriff's Office announced that Michael Raymond Popp, a 60-year-old truck driver from Toma, had been charged with the murder of Terry. Authorities revealed that back in January of 2023, DNA samples taken from Popp had matched material found in Terry's autopsy. Prosecutors say that Popp, who was 21 years old at the time of the murder, knew Terry personally. He had been a senior at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse and had lived near Terry's mobile home. He initially told police that Terry was only a casual acquaintance, but when confronted with the DNA evidence, he claimed that they, quote, maybe had a little affair, lasting 6 to 8 months. Popp told police that back in March of 1985, he and his girlfriend had attended pool tournaments with Terry and Russell and were often paired as partners. The now 60-year-old truck driver denied killing the 24-year-old woman and told police that he is not a violent person and that he had no idea how his DNA would have gotten on Terry's body. When Pop's ex-girlfriend was interviewed by police in 1987, she was asked if he had the potential to commit Terry's murder, and she reportedly replied, quote, "Mike is capable of doing something like this because he has a lot of different personalities." However, she said she didn't believe that he was involved. Pop's girlfriend had broken up with him in 1986 when she filed a court injunction against him for physical abuse. He was finally arrested for Terry's murder and is now being held in Vernon County Jail. He faces life in prison if convicted. On the evening of March 22, 1993, Carmen Van House, a kind and empathetic 19-year-old, visited her ailing grandmother, who was convalescing in Community Hospital South in Indianapolis. The teen was accompanied by her father, James Van House Sr., and her youngest brother, who had just turned 3. After spending time with her elderly grandmother, whom she loved very much, Carmen gave her family a ride back to their Southside Indianapolis home, arriving around 9:30 p.m. Her father had asked Carmen to stay, but she said that she had to get home to wash her Pizza Hut uniform. She was currently waitressing for the casual restaurant chain. Carmen returned to her studio apartment, never to be seen alive again. At approximately 11:30 p.m., neighbors reported hearing Carmen and an unidentified male engaging in conversation and laughter as they entered her apartment. However, at around 1:30 a.m., they heard the sounds of a violent altercation coming from her residence. One neighbor said that they heard Carmen yell, quote, "Get off of me, get off of me." They also reported hearing hurried footsteps leaving the apartment. Shockingly, and to the later regret of many involved, no one called the police. However, someone did complain to complex management, who left a handwritten note on Carmen's door, chiding her for the noise and telling her to be more considerate of her neighbors. The following day, Carmen failed to report for her shift at Pizza Hut. On March 24th, after multiple days of missed work, Pizza Hut managers were worried and looked up Carmen's emergency contact on her employment application, eventually reaching Carmen's father. Concerned, her father went to Carmen's apartment the next day, where he discovered a brutal and tragic scene. Carmen was laying on the floor, naked. Her body had bled out from multiple stab wounds. There were signs of a struggle, including a knocked-over table, clothing thrown on the floor, and a large pool of blood near Carmen's head. There was also blood spatter around her body. Autopsy reports showed that Carmen had over 60 stab wounds to her head, face, and body. She was missing her left earring, which appeared to have been torn from her ear. It is believed that the weapons involved may have included a pocket knife and/or a screwdriver. DNA evidence was recovered from Carmen's body, and blood from a source other than Carmen was found on a paper bag inside of her apartment. Investigators believed the assault took place in the living room, with the suspect possibly going into the kitchen to wash himself afterwards. Several people, including some of the ex-boyfriends of Carmen, were questioned, but there were no suspects. At the time, Carmen's grandmother had tragically also just died, and the family could not afford a second funeral, so therefore they were forced to fundraise in the community for contributions to help bury their daughter, and also for money to offer a reward for information about their daughter's killer. Over the years, detectives interviewed numerous individuals and pursued hundreds of leads, but the case ultimately grew cold. Captain Bill Carter of the Indianapolis Police Department began investigating the case himself almost a decade after it happened. In his spare time, he raised funds through GoFundMe for specialized DNA testing. He also established a Facebook group and a website titled Justice for Carmen Van House. In the year 2000, detectives requested to add Van House's DNA to state and national databases, but with no new hits. In 2013, using the evidence found on the bag in Carmen's apartment, forensic scientists were able to obtain a partial DNA profile of a male, but they were unable to find a match in the system. In 2018, the police submitted the suspect's DNA for advanced testing, including genetic genealogy, and in 2023, a DNA analysis company contacted them with information that someone they described as an identified user was possibly related to a person of interest in Carmen's murder case. This communication ultimately led to the identification of a suspect, Dana Jermaine Shepard, 52, of Columbia, Missouri. The 52-year-old man, who would have been 21 at the time, was working as a janitor at the University of Missouri when he was visited by Indianapolis Metropolitan Police detectives earlier this year. Investigators wrote in an affidavit that Shepard was visibly shaking as he read their warrant for his DNA. Shepard was finally arrested in the fall of 2024 on 2 counts of murder and 1 count of rape with deadly force. In addition, the Boone County Court charged him with being a fugitive from out of state. It is unknown how the company acquired Dana Shepard's DNA, as he was simply called a user, which made some in the media wonder if he had submitted to some sort of familial DNA website, although no further information is available. According to court records, Shepard used to live in the same apartment complex and remained living there even after the killing. After detectives arrested Shepard, he invoked his constitutional right to a lawyer without ever speaking to the police. Therefore, many details of the case remain unknown, such as whether Carmen had planned to meet with him in her apartment or had met him spontaneously. Shepard is now being held without bond at Missouri's Boone County Jail, and an extradition hearing is set to be held in the future. After more than 31 years of uncertainty, the case can finally be brought to court so that justice may be served. On June 11th, 2000, Julianne McDonald, a pharmacist at Memorial Hospital in Chattanooga, Tennessee, was found dead in her home in Lafayette, Georgia, about 25 miles south of her work. A later autopsy report would indicate that the 42-year-old smart and studious woman had been deceased for 3 to 4 days prior to her body being discovered. A medical examiner reported that she had been stabbed several times before being left to die. At the time, authorities believed that Julie had known her killer due to the absence of any signs of a forced entry. The case was reassigned several times throughout the years before evidence was much more recently submitted for testing. Ultimately, it was this act which contributed to charges being filed against Clarence D. George. The now 63-year-old man, who was 39 at the time of Julie's brutal killing, was taken into custody by U.S. Marshals on August 22, 2024. Prior to his arrest, he had been watched and observed by the marshals in his home in Jefferson County, Alabama. George had initially been identified as one of 4 or 5 suspects in the case. Special Agent in Charge Joe Montgomery of the Georgia Bureau of Investigations said that George surfaced to the top of the list in part because he was found in neighboring Catoosa County with Julie's checkbook in his possession. Investigators say the pair were acquaintances, not expanding on such a label except to comment that the two knew each other before the grisly murder. George is being charged with murder and aggravated assault. He remains in custody in Jefferson County, Alabama, where he's awaiting extradition to Walker County, Georgia, to face justice after evading it for nearly 25 years. Julie McDonald still has a niece and nephew alive, and they have since been made aware of the arrest. Special Agent Montgomery warned any still unidentified yet guilty individuals who have previously taken the lives of others and are now living free that technology and police procedure will catch up to them eventually, saying, quote, "All you bad guys out there that done these murders and you haven't been brought to justice, we're coming. May not be today, may not be tomorrow, but we're coming. Tanya Weber was a 17-year-old girl studying at Logan High School. She lived with her parents and 4 younger siblings at 454 West Center Street in Logan, Utah. On June 25, 1965, Tanya Weber's parents and her sisters had traveled to a family reunion in Weiser, Idaho, leaving their oldest daughter home to attend the wedding of a friend. Tanya had joyfully attended and assisted at the wedding. She also caught the bride's bouquet at the reception. After the happy event, Tanya, along with 3 other girls, went out to eat before heading home. Tanya was dropped off at her home, located at 454 West Center Street, at around 12:15 in the morning. When she reached her front porch, she realized she had forgotten her house key in the car, and as her parents and her siblings were away at the family reunion, she had no way to get in. As such, she left her bouquet on the porch and ran after the car that had dropped her off, hoping to catch up with them. A boy who lived in the neighborhood, who was watching late-night TV, reported seeing Tanya out of his window. This would be the last time she was seen alive. The next morning, a neighbor found her body just blocks away from her home. Tanya had been shoved behind the bushes at the rear of a home located at 324 West Center Street. She was found partially clothed and with one of her own stockings tied around her neck. A pathologist later stated that she died between midnight and 2 a.m. The pathologist's report noted that while the stockings were around her neck, they were not used to strangle her. Marks on her body indicated that she had been choked to death by hand. The medical examiner stated that the stockings appeared to be, quote, an afterthought on the part of the killer. From the bruises, scratches, and mud stains, it appeared that her body had been dragged for some distance before being abandoned. A shoe, stocking, and ripped blue shirt were found near the body. The medical examiner stated that they found no evidence of sexual assault. Police questioned Tanya's friends, family, and all the guests who attended the wedding reception. However, nothing came of those interviews. They also questioned neighbors, but besides the young boy who had watched Tanya run, no one had seen her. He stated that she did not look like she was running in a frantic fashion as though she was being chased. Over the years, there would be several suspects, but they would eventually be released for lack of evidence. Among those suspects, there was one in particular to whom police paid close attention. The man, 27-year-old Owen Kimball, lived just a few blocks away from Tanya and knew her personally. The statements police collected suggested that Kimball had been at the scene around the time of Tanya's death. When police went to question him, his wife said that he had been missing since June 28th. His wife reported to police that Kimball had told her he was going up to Logan Canyon in order to collect bait for an upcoming fishing trip with his 2 young sons, but that he never returned. After intense searching, a civilian pilot flying over Mount Logan located Kimball's pickup truck, hidden in heavy brush at the head of Spring Hollow. When members of the Cass Sheriff's Jeep Patrol reached the truck, they found Kimball dead inside, with material stuffed in the vehicle's tailpipe, apparently used for the purposes of asphyxiation. Kimball's death was ruled a suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. The following day, a newspaper article identified Kimball as the primary suspect in Tanya's murder, citing police reports that several pieces of physical evidence, later revealed to be a shoe print and clothing fibers, connected him to the scene. Despite this, Kimball's wife vehemently maintained his innocence, and his in-laws, a prominent family from Logan, also supported him unwaveringly in the days that followed. After Kimball's death, the Cache County attorney said that there were, quote, no prime suspects to prosecute, therefore leaving the case of Tanya's murder unresolved. The case remained cold for the next 50 years. Then, in 2022, Logan City Police reopened the case. Tanya's clothing was sent to the Utah State Crime Lab for DNA analysis, which revealed the presence of DNA from several different men. Subsequently, investigators chose to obtain a DNA sample from Kimball's remains. A court order was issued to exhume Kimball's body. On November 2, 2023, his remains were sent to the Utah Medical Examiner's Office for DNA collection. Kimball's DNA was found to be an exact match to the DNA found on Tanya's clothing. Upon review of the numerous statements and evidence collected from the 1965 investigation, as well as the recently obtained DNA sample, authorities were comfortable stating that Mr. Kimball did in fact kill Tanya. In a press release, authorities stated that, quote, "this evidence would be sufficient to obtain a verdict beyond a reasonable doubt." The case was finally solved after 59 years. All 4 of Tanya's younger siblings are still living: her sisters Julie Wiley and Rhonda Christensen, and her brothers Stephen and David Weber. In regards to the closing of the case, Rhonda Christensen said, quote, "there are no words to express how it feels after 59 years. She goes on to say that they are truly grateful to the law enforcement and civilian volunteers who cared about solving the case, and for the resources and time spent on pursuing answers. Hammer Woodward was a 46-year-old woman living with her husband, Leslie H. Woodward. The two had married in 1953 and together started Woody's Tavern in 1963. Woody's was one of many bars in the bustling city of Moab, Utah. By 1973, Ann had 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters, and was operating the bar in town. On March 2, 1973, Ann failed to return home after closing the bar by herself in the early morning hours. When she never came back, her husband Leslie decided to check the bar. At 6:45 a.m., he opened the bar door to find a horrifying sight. He saw Ann's partially nude body lying on the floor between 2 pool tables. Ann's husband immediately called police. Upon arrival, police noted that the cash register had been rifled through and an undetermined amount of money had been stolen. Crime scene investigators found a pack of playing cards on one of the tables and Camel cigarette butts in an ashtray. These were collected and preserved as evidence. An autopsy revealed that the mother of 4 had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled to death by her own trousers. The police believed that the perpetrator had been a patron of the bar who had stayed in the tavern, quote, after closing time. Unfortunately for investigators, there was not a lot of evidence present at the crime scene. Authorities questioned the patrons who visited the bar that day, and 25 men became persons of interest, but due to lack of concrete evidence, no one was charged with Ann's murder, and the case would soon go cold. Ann's murder has haunted the small and close-knit desert town of Moab for over half a century. While police were not able to find her killer, they believed that Ted Bundy was the likely culprit, as he also had raped and killed multiple women in the area around the time of Ann's death. Authorities noted that while Bundy admitted to 30 murders, his real victim count is yet unknown. Police had never been able to prove that Bundy was the culprit, however, due to a lack of evidence. So they inertly and irresponsibly assumed that Ann was just another one of his unnamed victims, and so the case file would merely collect dust in the coming decades. In 2006, Moab police reopened Ann's file in the hopes that new DNA technology could help solve the cold case, but little came of it. That same year, the former Moab police chief, Melvin Dalton, was quoted as admitting that, quote, a lot of evidence from the slaying may have been lost. Dalton also pointed out that the crime scene back in 1973 may not have been properly processed, commenting, quote, people were going in and out like they were going to church, he said. There wasn't a sign up, no tape up, nothing that said police line, do not cross. During the investigation, Dalton had given several individuals polygraph tests and had some suspects, but both individuals got attorneys and therefore they did not provide any further information. In light of the lack of new evidence, Dalton decided to keep the DNA from both the victim and all potential suspects, in hopes that one day the right technology could be used to identify the killer. Meanwhile, the case would eventually go cold again until 2023, when a new detective working on the case, Jeremy Dexler, decided to uncover the 2 boxes of evidence collected from the initial investigation and send it to the crime lab. The DNA evidence had sat at the Moab Police Department's storage unit for over 50 years and was not easy to locate as it had been moved to another building. But eventually, the DNA results came back at the end of May 2024, and the results confirmed that one Doug Chudomelka was the killer. A substantial amount of Chudomelka's DNA was on the inside of Anne's pants and on all the buttons of her shirt. Chudomelka had a history of violent behavior and was one of 25 suspects in the case. While nearly anyone who had frequented Woody's bar was considered a suspect, Chudomelka stood out due to several incriminating factors. His mid-1960s Ford sedan resembled the car witnesses claimed was parked next to Anne's the night of March 1st. Autopsy results state that Anne was murdered sometime between 1:40 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. in the early morning hours of March 2nd. At the time, Chudomelka told investigators that he had spent the night drinking at the Westerner Grill, not at Woody's. However, the bartender at the Westerner denied ever seeing him there on the night of March 1st. Chudomelka's girlfriend, Joyce, initially provided an alibi, stating that he had arrived home around 2 a.m. on March 2nd, but she later corrected this to 4:10 a.m. On July 3, 1973, Chudomelka had been arrested for domestic violence. During this period, Joyce alleged that he was Anne's killer and expressed her willingness to speak with the county attorney. However, she later retracted her statement and only confirmed that Chudomelka had come home at 4 a.m., not at 2 a.m. Chudomelka and the other suspects were asked to take polygraph tests, but Chudomelka was too intoxicated at the time for the test to be administered. Eventually, he ceased cooperating with police and requested legal representation. Later, Chudomelka was convicted of cattle rustling in San Juan County and served a probationary period before leaving the area for good. Although Chudomelka did not know the victim personally, Detective Drexler speculates that he might have played poker with Anne at the pub and could have been angered by the fact that he lost. Drexler also suggested that the crime could have been a crime of opportunity rather than a premeditated act of rage, given Chudomelka's drunken, violent history. Chudomelka passed away in 2002 at the age of 67 without ever facing justice for the crime. However, county lawyer Stephen Stocks is convinced that had he lived, he would have been found guilty of murder. The case could finally be considered closed after more than 4 decades. Dorothy Marie Selle was born on June 1, 1949, in Mandan, North Dakota. She graduated from Mandan High School in 1967. In 1980, she'd been living in the Seattle area and working 2 jobs. By day, she was an instructor at the Boeing Aircraft Company, and most nights she worked at the Gianto Pizza restaurant for extra money, as her divorce had left her with little resources. She had previously been married to Michael Selle, but they were now legally divorced and she lived alone. On February 23, 1980, Dorothy was last seen leaving her shift at Gianto's Pizza somewhere between 10 p.m. and 11:15 p.m. The pizzeria was only 3 blocks from her condominium on 106th Avenue Southeast. 48 hours later, when Dorothy had failed to show up for work at Boeing for 2 consecutive days, her family and friends became concerned and requested a police welfare check. A Kent police officer, accompanied by a family friend, went to her condo to investigate. They found the front door locked and 3 newspapers on the porch. However, they noticed that the sliding glass door at the back of the condo was slightly ajar, about 16 to 18 inches open, with the drapes drawn. Crime scene technicians later discovered that the screws securing the locking anchor to the door frame were loose, which had facilitated the break-in. Upon fully entering the condo, they found Dorothy's nude body upstairs in a room that seemed to be used for sewing. A brown robe was wrapped around her lower left arm and hand, and there were marks on her neck consistent with bruising. An autopsy later revealed that Dorothy had died from asphyxia due to cervical compression. She had also sustained blunt force trauma to her head. The examination indicated that she had been violently beaten, strangled, and sexually assaulted before being left partially naked for dead. At the time of the murder, investigators collected sperm samples from her body and her robe, but DNA technology was still in its infancy in 1980, and nothing substantial was able to be ascertained from the samples. In February of 1996, the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab examined the DNA evidence from the bathrobe, but their results were inconclusive. By 2002, the DNA was entered into the Combined DNA Index System, also known as CODIS, but no matches were found. Advances in technology in 2016 allowed the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab to finally obtain a partial DNA profile from Dorothy's bathrobe. In March of 2022, senior forensic genealogist Misty Gillis, working for Identifiers International, used her advanced forensic genealogy techniques to compare the DNA profile to others. Her efforts identified 11 potential suspects. Among these suspects were brothers Kurt and Kenneth Kundert, who were both incarcerated for unrelated assaults. Authorities coordinated with the Van Buren County Sheriff's Office in Arkansas in order to request voluntary DNA samples from the brothers. Kurt provided a sample, which was not a match, leading to his exclusion as a suspect. Kenneth, however, did not cooperate. Believing Kenneth to be the suspect, Camp Police surveilled him in Arkansas. While smoking in a Walmart parking lot, Kenneth discarded a cigarette butt, which detectives retrieved and tested. The DNA on the base of the cigarette matched the DNA recovered from the crime scene. Further investigation revealed that Kenneth had worked in the Snohomish County area in 1987, and he lived in an apartment complex that was only about 1,200 feet from where Dorothy was murdered. During an interview, Kenneth appeared nervous, smoking a pack of cigarettes and carefully discarding the butts and a crushed water bottle into his own pocket. On August 20th, 2024, Kenneth Kundert was finally arrested and charged for Dorothy Silzel's murder. His bail had been set at $3 million cash or bond. Although his arraignment was originally scheduled for August 29th, 2024, it was later postponed as he is currently fighting his extradition from Arkansas. Three-year-old Karen Wurst was last seen in the company of her mother, Doris Wurst, in Plantation, Florida in 1974. Doris was a dedicated caregiver, committed to raising her young toddler with love. On November 7, 1974, Doris and Karen were seen departing in a 1961 red Chevy Impala. This would be the last time anyone would ever see the mother and daughter ever again. The police were notified and a search ensued, but no leads were uncovered and the trail would eventually grow cold. Sadly, for a missing person in Florida, it's more than just a stereotype that they'll be found in the water. It's a grim reality that frequently proves true. This saying is especially accurate in a state where vast networks of rivers, swamps, and coastal lines blur the boundaries between land and sea, creating an environment where disappearances too often lead investigators straight to the water's edge. With limited funding and overwhelmed agencies, the search for answers often stalls long before the truth can be uncovered. After the case grew cold, Karen's missing persons photo was circulated to nearby regions in the form of an age-progressed image, this one to make her look 50 years old. But thanks to the efforts of Sunshine Sonar, a group which conducts volunteer searches for missing person cases, it would later be uncovered that Karen never made it past age 3. Sunshine State Sonar began looking for the missing mother and child in South Florida in June of 2023. The team eventually located the 1960s Chevrolet Impala in a local canal, along with skeletal remains consistent with an adult and small child. To raise awareness for their robust volunteer effort, Sunshine State Sonar posted a video of the search mission, as well as footage of the car being recovered from the water. DNA testing later confirmed the identities of mother and child, and police said next of kin have been contacted. Shockingly, and to the surprise of all involved, at 9 a.m. on August 10, 2024, in a murky body of water near Wimbledon Lake Drive, while Sunshine State Sonar was focused on conducting their search operation for the missing mother and daughter, their sonar detected a second submerged vehicle, this one sitting 22 feet down in the shadowy depths of the water. Their sonar detected a second submerged vehicle, this one sitting 22 feet down in the shadowy depths of the water. In an unexpected twist, this would begin the recovery efforts for the second vehicle that day, thus solving two separate missing persons cases in just 24 hours. With the Plantation Police Department on scene, divers entered the water, retrieving a license plate number that linked this vehicle to a 20-year-old missing persons case, a case that had been entirely off the radar of the Broward Sheriff's Office, whose dive team soon arrived on scene, confirming the presence of human remains inside the sunken vehicle. The car was found upside down, deeply embedded in silt, with its windows rolled down, turning each movement that the dive team made into a painstaking recovery effort. The body was eventually discovered to be that of World War II veteran Bernie Novak. Bernie, a husband and father of 3 who had been reported missing after failing to return home in Lauderdale West community, was finally recovered after more than 2 decades underwater. He, along with his silver Buick LeSabre, disappeared in 2004. Bernie was remembered for his war stories, and he enjoyed bowling and ping pong in his retirement years. More than 20 years had passed between Bernie's disappearance and the recovery of his body, and with no leads as to his whereabouts, his family had been in a constant state of confusion and shock. Reflecting on the search efforts for his father, who seemed to have fallen off the face of the earth, his son Joey recalls, 20 years ago at this time, we were down in Florida looking for the car. We had a memorial service about 5 years later, and I really put everything behind us with closure, but I always imagined this is how it happened. Now, Joey said he can finally lay his father to rest in peace. I am very proud of him, Joey said, and I learned a lot from him. He lives in my brain and my heart every day. Joey says that he plans to place Bernie's remains next to that of his mother's at the family cemetery. On February 19, 1976, Everett Hawley, 72, said goodbye to his wife, Etha, unaware that this ordinary farewell would mark the start of a day that would spiral into the unexpected. That morning, Everett was picked up from his home in Stockton, Illinois, by his business partner, Clarence Owens. Clarence had arrived in style in his newly painted, bright gold 1966 Chevy Impala. His wife recalls that both men wore business suits, and she remembers that she reminded her husband to bring just a light overcoat due to the unusually warm February day. Everett and Clarence spent their days buying and selling real estate, often driving through northern Illinois looking for farms to buy. That day, the two attended a political rally for gubernatorial candidate James Thompson at the American Legion Hall in Pentaconica. After the rally, they visited a local hangout called Rocky's Cafe for pie and coffee, before heading to Clarence's son's house to show off his car's new paint job. Clarence's son wasn't home, but they briefly spoke to his daughter-in-law and mentioned their plans to attend a nearby auction on their way to an appraisal appointment. The auctioneer at the Borgman farm later recalled seeing Everett walk up the driveway while Clarence waited in the car. This was the last confirmed sighting of the men. The next day, their families reported them missing when the two failed to return home. Authorities initially thought they might have been in a car accident, However, as days passed with no sign of the men nor Clarence's car, police theories shifted to possible foul play, with some believing that the men had disappeared voluntarily. A massive search effort was launched, involving local police, civil defense units, and 5 airplanes scanning the roads between the areas the men were last seen, but to no avail. Both men were described as hardworking and family-oriented, with no known enemies or motives for the disappearance. Everett was devoted to his wife, Etha, and Clarence was very close to his 3 sons, one of whom was a respected local police officer. Authorities found no clues and were left with no leads to follow, therefore the case grew cold. Everett's wife, Etha Hawley, passed away shortly after the first anniversary of his disappearance. Her death was said by some to be from a broken heart, a tragic end that reflected the despair and confusion she carried. For many, Etha's passing marked a final chapter, deepening the belief that Everett would never be found alive. In 2005, a theory emerged, linking the case to the 1976 kidnapping of Fred Lickle, a cashier clerk who was taken hostage after a farm auction in Wisconsin by one William Exline. Though Exline denied involvement in the men's disappearance, similarities between the case were noted by law enforcement, but no arrests were ever made. Until 2024, there was no trace of Everett, Clarence, or Clarence's prized gold car. Families and even retired investigators of the case tell the media they were haunted by the mystery of what had happened to the 2 men on that sunny February day. Finally, in March of 2024, civilians enjoying a day of fishing along the Pentaconica River discovered a submerged vehicle using their sonar fish finder, a digital way to map underwater environments. Authorities were quickly informed. The town sheriff noted the difficulty of the ensuing search. The vehicle lay partially embedded in mud at a depth of 8 to 10 feet, a shallow resting place by some measures, yet treacherous enough to complicate the recovery efforts. Authorities were able to use a crane, and there they pulled out a 1966 Chevrolet Impala sedan. More than 100 bones were retrieved from inside the vehicle and the surrounding riverbed. DNA later extracted from the bones was compared with DNA profiles from the men's relatives in order to identify them. Testing performed confirmed the bodies found were the remains of the 2 businessmen and longtime friends. Before the DNA testing, in an effort to rule out a previously unknown homicide, the remains were examined by a forensic anthropologist in St. Louis, Missouri, who found no evidence of trauma. Winnebago County coroner said that how the 2 men died is still unknown, but that no foul play is suspected. The sheriff of the town reminded the public, quote, "This is a testament to the dedication and perseverance of our detectives and forensic experts. It's a reminder that no case is truly ever closed, no matter how much time has passed." It should also be noted that this would not have been possible without the proactive actions of the civilians, who were enjoying an otherwise ordinary day of fishing before they changed the lives of not 1 but 2 families. On September 21st, 1996, what began as an act not born of teenage rebellion but of teenage self-care ended in a senseless murder when 15-year-old Danielle Hutchin asked her mother for permission to drive to Cameron Bridge fishing access site, seeking some time alone after a family argument. The teen left her home in Belgrade, Montana at around 11 a.m. and drove her pickup truck to the picturesque nature preserve, located just a few miles south. An innocent place to wind down after an innocuous conflict at home. Danielle, who went by Danny to those closest to her, was familiar with the area and had visited Cameron Bridge previously. The site was commonly used by locals to access miles of wade fishing spots. In the early autumn breeze, those who visited the place regularly say that in the early autumn breeze, the cottonwood trees would have been molting, its billowy tufts falling and flurrying like snow on the banks of the Gallatin River. When she didn't return home at the expected time, her mother grew concerned and elicited the help of a family friend in order to begin searching for the 15-year-old. Danielle's mother remembered that her daughter had been dressed in blue jeans and a gray sweatshirt. She'd also been wearing a knee brace on her left leg, remnants of an injury she had sustained while dancing with friends at a street festival just weeks prior. Once the two arrived at the preserve, they were alarmed to discover Danny's unlocked truck in the parking lot of the recreation area, her water bottle and car keys nearby. For 2 hours, they searched the area frantically for Danny, but finally, at around 5 p.m., they contacted the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office and reported the 15-year-old missing. Local search and rescue, along with citizen volunteers, quickly arrived and continued looking for the teen, an effort which persisted until darkness fell. The lack of light made it increasingly dangerous to navigate the wooded and marshy terrain, and therefore the search was ended without any indications of the teen's location. Or had fallen victim to more nefarious circumstances, the teen's now panicked family were grateful when 2 brothers who lived nearby took over the search out of the kindness of their own hearts. The brothers were well acquainted with the area and resumed searching at the urging of one of their own children, who was friends with Danielle's sister. After approximately 45 minutes of scouring the now dark area, one of the brothers was horrified to stumble upon Danny's lifeless body, laying face down in a shallow pool of water. In an autopsy conducted on September 23, 1996, the medical examiner stated that they had found, quote, muddy material in the 5'5", 130-pound teenager's stomach. The same material was also observed in her upper and lower airways, indicating that the teen most likely put up a valiant fight and in doing so may have been shoved into the ground, subsequently inhaling the moist dirt below her. To the pain of the teen's family, also noted in the autopsy report was the observation of a recent laceration of her private parts, indicating a sexual assault. Her watch, gold with an elastic band, was pulled partway over her hand, as if she had been dragged by that arm. The medical examiner noted that her clothing appeared to be improperly positioned, with her bra pulled above her breasts and her underwear with the left lateral lower edge rolled over the top, indicating that she may have been moved or dragged in a way that disturbed her undergarments. To no one's surprise, the autopsy report confirmed what her family and friends already knew, that the well-behaved and studious teen had no alcohol nor drugs in her system. Despite all of these findings, later, to the shock and reported disgust of many involved, a state medical examiner determined that Danny had drowned, classifying the manner of death not as a homicide, but as unknown. This classification complicated the investigation by shifting focus away from foul play, which potentially could lead to overlooked evidence or lack of investigation of suspects. The labeling of her death as unknown reduced the urgency and resources allocated to the case and created significant barriers in identifying a suspect. Eventually, with no leads or new developments, the case would grow cold. The sheriff's office decided to reinvigorate their investigation of the case in 2019. Initially, such an action was the reopening of old wounds, as Danny's family had felt a significant distrust towards law enforcement due to the past classification and subsequent handling of the case. Even former police officers who had worked the case expressed their deep frustration over the initial handling of the investigation, with some alleging a systematic lack of urgency to find a suspect. The previous Sheriff Slaughter, who was in charge at the time, defended the investigation, stating that the detectives pursued it as a homicide despite some public proclamations suggesting otherwise. However, Danny's family members dispute that law enforcement ever communicated their intent to investigate the teen's death as a homicide. The slain victim's sister, Stephanie Mollett, who was only 12 at the time of the murder, recalls police's response in the aftermath of the crime, saying, quote, "What my parents took away from the law enforcement investigation was, well, it could have been just an accident." In 2021, after more than a quarter century of uncertainty, Dan Springer, who had just become the Gallatin County Sheriff, made the wise and ultimately game-changing decision to bring in 2 outside experts from California to assist in the investigation of the teen's death. made the wise and ultimately game-changing decision to bring in 2 outside experts from California, hiring private investigator Tom Elfmont, a retired LAPD officer, and Sergeant Court Depweg, a forensic DNA specialist. Elfmont was sworn in as a special service deputy, and together the two took inventory of the evidence that was collected in 1996. In August of 2023, based on what the sheriff's department said was new findings, but those close to the case believe was more likely a re-examination of old findings, the manner of Danny's death was officially changed from undetermined to homicide. The two ultimately took possession of 4 rootless human hair strands that had been collected from Danny's body at the crime scene. Those strands were sent to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia, who used them to create a partial DNA profile. That profile was then passed on to famed genetic genealogist C.C. Moore, a pioneer in the use of autosomal DNA. Moore is the chief genetic genealogist for Parabon Nanolabs, heading their genetic genealogy services for law enforcement, boasting an unparalleled record of over 200 successful identifications of violent criminals in the 2 years since the unit's launch. Moore's method utilizes the DNA left by a suspect and matches it with DNA samples that have been voluntarily submitted by family members. This method allows law enforcement to build a more extensive family tree compared to simply using databases like CODIS alone. Ultimately, after extensive testing and confirmations, authorities were able to identify 55-year-old Paul Hutchinson as a potential suspect. On July 23, 2024, investigators Elfmont and Depweg interviewed the now 55-year-old, who was living about 100 miles away in Dillon, Montana, but had been living in Bozeman at the time of Danny's death. P.I. Elfmont recalls Hutchinson, quote, turned white when he and Depweg introduced themselves and stated their purpose for asking to speak with him face-to-face. The subsequent interview lasted for nearly 2 hours, during which Hutchinson displayed a high level of anxiety. Investigators carefully watched as Hutchinson became visibly agitated. His brow glistened with sweat, he repeatedly scratched at his face, and in a particularly unsettling movement, he began chewing on his hand. The tension in the room escalated when detectives presented him with a photograph of Danny. Hutchinson's response was immediate and revealing. He slumped back into his chair, seemingly overwhelmed, as his body language conveyed discomfort and unease. Hutchinson, previously unknown to law enforcement, was a longtime fisheries biologist for the Bureau of Land Management in Dillon. Such a job specializes in the conservation and management of fish populations and their habitats, conducting research, monitoring aquatic ecosystems, and implementing habitat restoration. An avid outdoorsman and family man, he had been married for 22 years and had 2 adult children. Hutchinson had been a student at Montana State University in Bozeman around the time of Danny's senseless and seemingly random murder. Detectives believe the attack was spontaneous, stating that Hutchinson most likely encountered the 15-year-old by chance at the fishing access site, where she was believed to be alone. The sexual assault and subsequent slaying was most likely a, quote, crime of opportunity by an evil man. The slight similarities in surnames aside, detectives could discern no connection, personal or professional, between the 15-year-old and Paul Hutchinson, who would have been in his late 20s at the time of the murder. Upon authorities notifying the victim's family of the newly discovered culprit's name, Danny's sister recalls her initial reaction was that of relief that the killer wasn't a person known to Danny or her family. Reflecting, she said, quote, "It wasn't someone where we'd not only have to deal with everything that goes along with solving your sister's homicide case, but also that feeling of betrayal if it was her friend or a family friend or community member." To the shock of all involved, Hutchinson took his own life just 10 hours after investigators interviewed him. In the pre-dawn hours of July 24th, 2024, Hutchinson had called the Beaverhead County Sheriff's Office, simply informing them that he needed assistance before hanging up. Deputies who responded to the call for help found the 55-year-old on the side of the road. He was later pronounced deceased from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Days later, DNA collected from Hutchinson posthumously would prove to match DNA evidence collected from Danny's body, providing what the sheriff's department described as, quote, 100% confirmation that Paul Hutchinson was indeed the killer. At the time of his suicide, Paul's family was unaware of his connection to the well-known local tragedy, who by all accounts kept his family in the dark about his own personal darkness. After nearly 3 decades, Danielle's family was able to place another piece into the puzzle of grief they continued to endure. Danny's sister released a statement to the press, ruminating on the bittersweet nature of the findings. After nearly 28 years without justice, we celebrate today. Even though this man will not face a jury of his peers, I have no doubt that he was the one who forcefully and violently sexually assaulted my sister, then held her head down in a marsh until she choked to death on mud. When the time came to face up and account for his violence, he instead chose to end his life. He knew of his guilt and couldn't face my family or his family and the pain that he had caused. Terry Ann McAdams was a vibrant 22-year-old woman living in Arlington, Texas. She was known for her beauty, energy, and zest for life. From a young age, Terry was always popular. As a teenager, she cruised around in a convertible equipped with an 8-track music player, making her the go-to person for rides, and she often could be found driving around town with her friends or her sisters. After graduating from the University of Arkansas, where she'd met her fiancé, Terry moved to Arlington to be with him and to continue her education. She enrolled at the University of Texas in Arlington, eager to pursue her academic goals. But on Valentine's Day in February of 1985, tragedy struck. Arlington police were called to an apartment at 2525 Walnut Hill Circle. This was Terry's fiancé's apartment, where Terry had been living for the past 2 months. Inside, her lifeless body had been discovered by maintenance workers in the corner of her bedroom. An autopsy revealed that she had been sexually assaulted and savagely beaten to death with a blunt object. It was determined that she was killed on either the night of February 13th or early in the morning on February 14th. Police did not find a murder weapon, but believed that the killer had used a hammer or some other type of blunt instrument. At the time, a filtered cigarette butt was found at the scene, even though neither resident smoked. Investigators found evidence that the murderer had broken into Terry's apartment through a sliding glass door. Police say her killer left a distinctive footprint right outside. Police tried to piece together Terry McAdams' movements prior to her death. On February 13th, at around 4 p.m., she had left the University of Texas at Arlington and headed home to change clothes. She then made a few stops, including the Safeway grocery store on East Lamar. She had been planning to bake a cake for her fiancé for Valentine's Day. She also went to Reno Cleaners. Records showed that Terry had been at Safeway around 6:30 p.m., according to a cash register tape police recovered. Investigators questioned people who had been at the store that evening, hoping someone might have seen something unusual, but nothing would be found. At the time of her death, Terry's fiancé was out of town on a business trip. He had planned to return later that day, and the couple were set to be married in just a few months. He was quickly ruled out as a suspect. It was discovered that Terry's $5,000 engagement ring was missing when her body had been found. Police suspected her killer had stolen the ring and therefore distributed 250 flyers to local pawn shops across the Fort Worth and Dallas areas, as well as to gold and silver exchanges, but the ring was never recovered. For nearly 40 years, Arlington police and Terry's family have asked thousands of questions, but received little answers. The case would eventually go cold. In 2021, Arlington police reopened the case, and physical evidence, which included a sexual assault kit, fingernail clippings, and the cigarette butt, were sent to a DNA lab for testing. Based on these decades-old but well-preserved artifacts, a profile for an unknown male was developed. The profile was entered into CODIS, but never produced a match. In August of 2023, Arlington police reached out to the FBI Dallas field office to see if Terry's case would be eligible for the investigative genetic genealogy process, also known as IgG. IgG is a process that combines unidentified crime scene DNA, genealogy research, and the use of public history records to identify new leads for law enforcement. Genealogists were able to track down a distant relative whose subsequent DNA sample proved that 30-year-old Bernard Sharp was Terry's killer. Police do not believe the two knew each other and say the attack appears to be random. Unfortunately, Sharp could not be charged as he took his own life in a double murder-suicide. On November 3, 1985, Sharp fatally shot his estranged wife and her best friend and critically wounded his wife's cousin in Arlington, Texas. The wounded cousin was able to run to a neighbor's house for help. Police said Sharp had forced his way into the home and waited to ambush the woman. He had been considered a possible suspect in Terry's killing and was even questioned, but there was not enough evidence to link him to the crime. Sharp had lived nearby and had multiple arrests and a criminal history of sexual assault involving 2 victims other than Terry. Authorities say that they will continue to investigate whether he may have been responsible for any other unsolved crimes, and his DNA profile has been passed on to both federal and state authorities. Police say because of his death, no charges will be filed, but expressed hope that the development will provide the family with closure. The case was considered solved after 39 years.